Well, of course, the Jonas thesis is very radical, and it may not be true. It's just something you always have to keep in mind whenever you read anything, but especially in philosophy. It has to be dialectical. We have to read things critically. We have to look at things from different angles, and we really should question Jonas's one of his fundamental theses that traditional ethical frameworks are no longer adequate for human beings given the stage of their technological development. I thought it would be good to take a look at a couple of those traditional ethical frameworks that he has in mind. Two of them: Kantianism, which is just the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and the more general philosophy of consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is a utilitarianism being a form of consequentialism, but basically the only form that anyone cares about. So there are a couple of readings here from Kant, and a very sort of basic introduction to utilitarianism and consequentialism in general. Fully adequate materials to sort of get the basics of it. They're both actually very intuitive, and as they pretty much must be to be viable ethical theories, moral theories, they have to kind of harmonize with our intuitions about morality, our pre-philosophical intuitions about morality. Here we have just the very idea of the categorical imperatives. There's two versions of it that are given here. Kant's notion of the categorical imperative, which is a command that we must follow categorically without any kind of ifs, ands, or buts. Intuitively, he says, we know, number one, that whatever we do, whatever rule we follow, what he calls our maxim of action, in any given situation, whatever ethical rule we follow, we have to be consistent. And that means that it has to be universalizable. That is, we only know that we're acting ethically if we could coherently propose that whatever rule of action we were following should be a universal law or a rule for everyone. That is, that whatever I do, whatever rule I follow in my life, it cannot be ethical unless I can will that everyone follow the same rule. The second version of the imperative being the personhood, or sometimes called the humanity principle, but that's a little bit misleading. We could call it really the respect for persons principle. And that is what's down here in bold, that I should act always treating persons, whether my own person, myself, or others, always as ends in themselves and never as a means to one of my ends, which is a very intuitively, I think, a very agreeable principle insofar as we realize that we cannot treat persons like things, that there's entirely different rules for how we deal with other persons, and even perhaps with our own person, ourselves, as opposed to how we deal with things, non-persons, objects. Of course, this has all sorts of thorny questions in terms of how we are supposed to treat non-human creatures, animals, but we'll ignore those for the purposes of this course. They're very interesting questions of animal rights and things, but they're not what we're talking about here. But there's this distinction between persons and things, and that things can be used, freely used, but persons cannot. Persons need to be treated with respect, and the way that Kant puts that is that they need always to be treated as ends in themselves, and emphatically never to be treated as means only. Consequentialism being maybe the rival theory to Kantianism in the modern age, how to conceive of ethics, and the basic idea is that the ethical value of any act that we may perform is in its consequences, and especially if we're utilitarians, the consequences in terms of the effects of our actions on human happiness, human welfare. That basically human happiness or pleasure is an end in itself, is something that's always good. And so that anything in a sort of the net value sort of thinking. Anything that promotes human pleasure, welfare, happiness is all things being equal, is good. And anything that produces the reverse of happiness, unhappiness, suffering, is bad. So that we should always try to maximize the human happiness in the world and minimize the pain and unhappiness. It leads into all sorts of thorny questions about how that's actually to be worked out in practice, and maybe some consequences that we don't want to accept in terms of about what actions would be acceptable. But I think that it has a strong intuitive basis in terms of how we just in a common sense way think about how we should act or what guides us. So those are two of the ethical theories in a nutshell. And I, you obviously need to read it to get really informed. But that Jonas is saying is no longer adequate. And I thought it would be a good exercise to, first of all, look at this case study, which happens to deal with a software engineer, so kind of a computer ethics problem. And then maybe more interestingly, a current issue, something at least that's happened in the last few years, the so-called Facebook experiment. To try to look at those two things, first of all, the hypothetical, the fictional case study of the Occidental engineering case, and the real life case of the Facebook experiment, and try to evaluate them and see if Kantianism or utilitarianism, consequentialism, are adequate to successfully resolve, at least in an ethical way, resolve these cases. At least as a way of maybe testing out the Jonas thesis a little bit, in terms of what it, whether it's actually valid. I mean, I'm not saying either way it would invalidate the thesis, but it would be an interesting exercise. But the second thing we're going to do is to start talking about the singularity this week in specific, and we have a kind of an important, historically important Werner Vinge's The Coming Technological Singularity, which pretty much set the stage for modern discussion of the singularity. And it's in a fairly popular form so people like me can understand it, which is always good. As a way of getting into the discussion of the singularity, we'll be looking at some more extensive materials next week from Nick Bostrom, and be a little more philosophically rigorous. But this is a great essay, a very important essay by Vinge, and this really introduces the idea of the singularity in some detail, and may explain why I've asked you to spend time reading and thinking about the Jonas thesis too, in terms of the ethical challenges that the singularity may bring, and of course thinking also about whether things like the old ethical frameworks of Kantianism and utilitarianism really are adequate or not adequate for whatever challenges the idea of the singularity may bring along with it.